This is DBrief, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group.
Welcome to DBrief, the podcast that explains industry to policymakers and policy to industry. My name is Louise McGrath, Head of Industry Development and Policy at the Australian Industry Group, and I'm joined today by Ash Salardini, Chief Executive Officer of Sugar Manufacturers Australia. Welcome, Ash.
Thanks for having me on, Louise.
Now, we've talked a lot in this podcast about the crisis on fuel availability caused by the conflict in Iran. And I'm really interested to hear from Ash, who's been doing a lot of work on thinking about how biofuel could perhaps augment some of our supply issues. So, Ash, in wake of the recent fuel supply disruptions, what's the single most practical reason you can keep coming back to a national ethanol mandate? And what problem does it solve first? Is it the price shocks, the supply, days on hand, or investor confidence?
Yeah, look, that's a very good question. And I think the answer to that, it's why the mandate is such a powerful tool is that it actually addresses all three. And so just to give you some background, we produce about 360 million litres of ethanol today, and we could easily get up to 400 million with the right demand incentives. That's the equivalent of 10 additional days of petrol. So 10 additional days of reserves, which is probably around the third of the reserves we have now. The challenge we have is that less than half of that is being used for fuel purposes. So that's what the mandate does. So initially, it helps bring ethanol as a supply for petrol. And then in the long term, we can actually do $3 to $4 billion, a billion litres of ethanol, which is equivalent of 30% of the petrol supply in Australia. And that requires that long-term incentives and the long-term demand. So it actually addresses all three of those categories.
But it's always important to listen to the critics to understand what challenges we're facing. So what do you think the critics would say would be the biggest downside to that mandate? And why is it, if it's so useful, why do we think we need it?
Yeah, so I think there's one of it is history. And so the last time the mandates were a huge issue was in the early 2000s. And a couple of things happened there. One, the car fleet wasn't ready for it. And the second thing was that the standards hadn't been put in place. And so you did have issues around the quality of the fuel and potential damage to cars. Now, that was in the early 2000s. We're in 2026 now. If I told you last time we were asking for an ethanol mandate, can you go on your phone and look up the internet? You'd say Ash has had a stroke. Now the main way we sort of interact with the internet is on our phones, and so things have changed. Those sort of challenges do not exist anymore. If a car's built after the year 2000, ethanol is completely compatible with those cars, and in fact, new Euro standard cars have been calibrated for E10 fuel, which means you're actually going to get a worse emissions outcomes if you don't use E10, including higher emissions for aromatics, which is a carcinogenic.
Okay. And I see you also regularly ask for a federal roundtable on ethanol and biofuels. And Ash, you and I have been on a lot of federal roundtables, and most are noted only for how bad the coffee is. But let's say we have one, as you want, on ethanol and biofuels, and we could eavesdrop on the first 30 minutes. What are the three decisions that we'd really want, ignoring all the speeches and
Yeah, Louise, first of all, we don't want to keep you happy. So good coffee would be the first demand. Straight off the bat, non-negotiable. But I guess the first one is to have a principled position on this issue. And I think noting where we are in the world, noting where we are around sort of the divergence away from free trade and towards sovereign capability, I think we need to have an explicit and public priority around energy sovereignty, and that's a non-negotiable. And I think having that explicit and public sort of position naturally then leads to good decision-making from industry, from government, and from the supply chain as well. Now, being very specific about ethanol, what we are asking for is a national mandate, but very specifically, we're essentially asking for a renewable energy target for ethanol, for want of a better word, EET. And let's have a think about it in the last 20, 30 years, what energy policy has actually worked that has brought in supply and lowered prices. It's the RET. And so we're asking for the exact same mechanism for ethanol. And so if a producer wants to, produce a 2% blend across its entire sort of petrol stocks, fantastic, as long as you get to your target. If you want to do a 30% blend and keep your regular unleaded and your other types of petrols, knock yourself out. And if you're making more than the target, you can sell those credits to those who are making less. So you get sort of efficiency within the system as well. So what we're asking for is the RET for ethanol.
Okay. And the government does have a $1.1 billion cleaner fuels program, and it talks about dropping in cleaner fuels and bringing up local supply chain. So that seems to be aligned to sort of what you want. But what's the smartest way for sugar-based fuels to show up in that pipeline, without always the risk of overpromising?
Yeah, so supply side incentives are great and it is part of the solution. So the $1.1 billion cleaner fuels program, it's a great initiative and helps in that long-term sort of investment in the supply chain and investment in new technologies, whether it's for ethanol expansion, sustainable aviation fuel, or biodiesel. But I guess the demand side is probably the more important one for commercial businesses. If you have demand side certainty, you can take that to the bank. And in fact, you probably need less government support financially when you have the demand. And so one of the things here is we need absolute commitment from the government because everyone has been burnt by mandates before. So if you take it back to the Queensland mandates, that was supposedly going to create 4% demand. It's only creating 2.6% demand for ethanol. And that's probably one of the reasons that why a 90 million litre ethanol plant in the form of Dolby has closed down in 2021 because there was a mandate that sort of purported to make 4%, but unfortunately there's more caveats to that mandate than Swiss cheese. And so there's holes all over the place. And so we haven't got the demand that we've been looking for. So the very first thing is commitment to a mandate now, a 2% national ethanol mandate. And frankly, we have the supply capacity to provide all that mandate today. So the government said tomorrow there's a 2% national ethanol mandate. We have the supply now. And why I say that's important is if the government's not committed to doing that now, in the middle of a fuel crisis, when will they be? And so then we can really clearly understand that even in a fuel crisis, where this is one of the only supply side solutions, the government's not fully committed. If they are fully committed, then yes, I can see a very bright future.
Yes, because it's been interesting in all this talk, by Bowen and others, no mention really of biofuels. It's only really been oil-based fuel.
Yes, it's been oil-based fuel. We've just secured 100 million litres from Singapore. I've got some bad news for the government. The demand for ethanol has not increased at all during this period. And in fact, we actually export 100 million litres of ethanol this year. We will export 100 million litres of ethanol, which is essentially petrol. So while they are spruiking the benefits of getting an extra 100 million shipment from Singapore, there's a shipment of ethanol going the other way with the equivalent amount of essentially petrol. And this is probably a very bad outcome for fuel security.
Yeah, and unfortunately that 100 million is really just a day's worth when we get down to it. But as you talked a bit earlier around the evolution of technology and, the sort of the barriers, because I think a lot of people, when they hear ethanol, they assume that the hard bit is the tech. So what do you think is the real bottleneck in scaling the feedstock? Is it logistics, plant conversion, fuel standards, blending infrastructure, or demand certainty?
I think the first and foremost, if we're talking about expanding capacity, it's demand certainty. My members are commercial businesses, and in the end, they're not looking for handouts. They're multinational companies. If they can secure finance, they will do it. And demand certainty provides that opportunity to secure finance. So without the demand, you're stuck at the sort of square one. After that, it is the supply chain. So, in the end, it's great to have a capacity to build something, but, biofuels requires bio, which is natural material that has carbon in it, whether it's biomass, whether it's sugars, whether it's wheat starches. And if it's not aggregated, you need one hell of a supply chain, transport supply chain to bring it together. So, for example, we can make it from sugars, and we can also make it from biomass such as bagasse, which is a fibrous leftover from sugar. The reason why we have this available to us is that feedstock's aggregated, and there's about 20, 30 million tons of that feedstock. Now, imagine trying to move 20, 30 million tons of feedstock that's not aggregated. That's a huge cost, and it's very hard. It would be the equivalent of the second largest freight task in Queensland, moving 30 million tons of biomass. And that's what we're asking to do. So you need investment in that supply chain. And then the technology is probably the third order issue.
And research by Deloitte suggests we could gather and grow enough feedstock to produce roughly 8,000 to 12,000 megalitres of low-carbon liquid fuels per year. Australia consumed around 63,000 megalitres of all liquid fuels combined in the 12 months to January, and that included around 1,700 megalitres of ethanol-based fuel. So if we're ever going to be able to meet some of the current needs with energy, what do you think are the best uses of that feedstock potential?
Look, I think in the immediate and short to medium term, particularly for ethanol, it's in petrol. And one, from a commercial perspective, but then two, from a carbon abatement perspective. So while we're very behind the sustainable aviation fuel agenda, there's not a single commercial sustainable aviation fuel plant in Australia. And in the world, there's only probably one plant that's running at a loss and with huge government subsidy. So if we are being serious, ethanol is actually cost competitive with fossil fuel now in the form of petrol. Then from a carbon abatement perspective, it's actually the costs of carbon abatement through ethanol, through petrol versus sustainable aviation fuel is exponentially less. And so why would we in the short term find the most expensive way to achieve carbon abatement where we can actually achieve it at a much lower cost? And then in the long run, that ethanol capacity can actually go towards sustainable aviation fuel as the technology improves and as we electrify our transport fleet as well. So from every angle, the immediate term is ethanol through petrol. The medium to long term is then shifting that to the more hard to abate sectors such as SAF, maritime diesel, and biodiesel as well.
Yeah, and a lot of those conversations are going on as we think about future manufacturing in Australia and sovereignty, and we'll get into that after this break. Thanks.
You're listening to the DBrief podcast, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group. To find out more about how Australian Industry Group can help your business, visit australianindustry.group.com.au.
And welcome back to DBrief, where I'm speaking with Ash Salardini from Australian Sugar Manufacturers, particularly focused on biofuels. Ash, as part of the Future Made in Australia, an important scheme is the Guarantee of Origin scheme, which really gives people confidence that the product is from Australia and also meets, low emissions, etc. You've pointed to the Guarantee of Origin scheme and emissions accounting for biofuels as critical. What does a trustworthy certification need to look like so exporters, airlines, and the public actually believe it?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. And we probably have to take it to first principles. Essentially, what a good scheme has to be is develop trust amongst all stakeholders who might be using it. And so that's the first one, the general public, industry, and then international stakeholders as well. And why I say that international stakeholders is because, for example, airlines will not only have to demonstrate their sustainability credentials and their emissions credentials domestically, but also internationally. So that's the key issue that we need to demonstrate. And then why it's so important to us is that we're asking for that to underpin whatever demand side scheme that it might be, whether it's a RET for ethanol or whatever other sort of market incentives it is. It will need to underpin those markets. And so if the GO scheme is not credible, doesn't have buy-in and doesn't have trust, the rest of the sort of initiatives are very hard to actually land as well. So trust in a short amount of space and time, I'd say it has to sort of create trust amongst everyone using it and creating it.
I think the challenge for a fungible product like fuel or biofuel, you see that the benefit of the action, but you never actually see the product. And so for consumers and as I say for industry, you really need that certification to have that certainty if you're going to invest in it, if there is a price premium of any kind. Now, in Queensland, the evidence and sector messaging, you've painted a big bioeconomy vision with sugar-based fuels for aviation, renewable energy, new regional hubs. What has to be true for that to move from possible to inevitable?
Look, for sort of not trying to sound like a broken record, but I think when there's an obvious and critical action that's there to be had, if that's not done, it's very hard to then move forward and have big ambitions. The mandate now during a fuel crisis, where prices for diesel are above $3 and prices for petrol is oscillating between $2 and $3, should be a lay down misere. And so that's the first one. That would actually demonstrate commitment from state and federal governments. State governments in beefing up their mandates, Queensland and New South Wales, and a federal government in actually introducing a national ethanol mandate. That creates certainty that, yes, we can do actually what is probably the most easy thing to do now for the current situation. But the bigger opportunities, as you mentioned, is in things like sustainable aviation fuel, in biodiesel and the maritime diesel, and in other biomanufactured products, for example, alternative proteins or other critical food inputs and additives through precision fermentation. And so that requires investment. But again, demand side incentive is probably the first one to cab off the rank. And then we can have those conversations around how do we build these more value add sort of streams of products.
And, you know, a lot of the messaging from the government right now in this fuel crisis is just to provide confidence to the public and, you know, sort of calm the horses. So is there a first sort of proof point project that would help change that national mood? Because, you know, there is a big push now or concern from the broader public that we don't have that sovereign capability. So what do we need to do to give them that confidence?
The first one I would suggest is we can today, this year, we could make 400 million litres of ethanol and actually utilising that 400 million litres. So that's the first that would demonstrate commitment. Then I guess the next step would be actually expansion of that capacity. So 400 million litres is not a lot. If we want to do ethanol in petrol, we want to do sustainable aviation fuel. Frankly, 400 million litres of ethanol will underpin Cairns Airport's sustainable aviation fuel needs, and that's it. So that's not a very big ambition. So, you know, as I said, we can do 3-4 billion litres. So that's the next step. Are they going to actually put the rubber, let the rubber hit the road and actually back in the expansion of ethanol capacity in this country?
Now, through this conflict, as often happens, many of us become sort of daytime experts on supply chains. So now we're all very conscious of where our oil comes from, and we can see the plants in the Middle East and how they can connect to Asia, et cetera, and we're getting much more visibility. So let's sort of try to stitch the value chain for this together. We go from growers, mills, is it cane rail, then roads, ports. If there was a Strait of Hormuz sort of incident within your biofuels vision, where would it be? What's the break?
Yeah, look, it is a pretty stable supply chain. So obviously the growers are all located up and down the coast of Queensland, and they harvest. And so the harvesting sector is quite important to this supply chain. Goes on cane rail with the one leg of it being on the road to get to the sidings. Goes to the mills where everything is aggregated and products can be made, including ethanol and sugar. So the breakdowns in the mills would be probably the weakest part of that supply chain, which is the harvesting sector, which is struggling in terms of viability. So if I was going to say there is a pinch point in this, it's the harvesting sector. The other one is around loss of cane land to other uses, including urban encroachment as well. So in the end, particularly when you're in the fuel supply chain, you need a steady, reliable source of fuel, and you can't afford to be losing your capacity because while food supply chains require sort of certainty, fuel supply chains even more so.
And so you mentioned food, and I think some policy people, you know, might question that the value of biofuels when if we have to make a trade-off between food versus fuel. So what's the honest version of that concern, and how do you design bioenergy growth so it complements food production rather than competing with it?
And I think your last point is exactly the point. How do you do it in a complementary manner? The first thing to note is that there's a couple of pathways towards creation of biofuels. One's through alcohol to jet, ethanol. The other one is through biomass. And we have in this industry 20 million tons of biomass that could go towards the production of biofuels. There's absolutely no trade-off there. So that's the first point. So there are pathways that absolutely have no trade-offs. The second point is I think the concern about food versus fuel is sometimes selective. So this industry used to crush 34 million tons of sugar cane 6-7 years ago. Now we do 29. No one's concerned about that loss of that 5 million tons. And so what we're saying is if you have a concern, then have a holistic concern. And in fact, what biofuels will do is actually provide diversification and investment in the industry to keep our capacity as well. And so, in fact, it's probably going to underpin our capacity to continue to make food as well, versus the current state is which we lose sort of 2-3% of our capacity year on year. And over the years, we've shrunk from, 40 million tonnes at our height to now 29 million tonnes.
And as you say, Australia's sugar manufacturing is deeply trade exposed, and you and I are both old trade warriors. How do you compete when global rivals are backed by heavy subsidies and protective settings? I mean, I know every time the EU FTA, whenever I spoke to my colleagues in the EU, they'd say, the sugar beets will be straight onto this. There's no competition there. How do we get to that competitiveness that means beyond just cutting costs?
That's a great question. I think it goes to that bigger picture where we're moving away from free trade principles to sovereign capability. I think that's the movement we're seeing. I think the EU FTA even would suggest that it wasn't actually a free trade agreement, more so than an economic and geopolitical agreement. And so free trade is no longer the the priority sort of outcome, even in a free trade agreement, which sounds like a silly thing to say. In the absence of that, government has to use the other, trade and market access is not the only tool the government has. That's why we have industry policy. That's why we have taxation policy. There are other levers to pull. And I think we're at that point where we need to pull the industry policy lever. One way to do it without subsidies around more R&D, for example, for advanced manufacturing, around that advanced genomics, so we can breed cane that is optimizes both sugar and carbon, as in get more sugar and get more fuel. These are the types of things we can start to do to actually compete globally without subsidizing. If you are going to subsidize as well, you got to be very careful to actually engender the right behaviors, and potentially subsidizing the supply chain as opposed to outcomes might be the better course. That's transport, logistics, which is a no regret way forward, even if your pet project or your pet product doesn't get up.
And with Asia, I guess, is the main destination for all Australian sugar. What are customers demanding? Are they, because I think, as the region becomes wealthier, are they asking for better quality specs, better reliability? Are they looking for sustainability credentials or traceabilities? What do you think is the biggest change inside mills right now?
Yeah, so quality is one of the major factors. So polarity, which is the purity of the sugar, and customers are definitely seeking it and paying a premium for it. The next set of issues is around sustainability, and this ebbs and flows. So if you asked me 2 years ago, I'd say, yes, this is a significant sort of criteria, particularly in 5-10 years' time, that they'll be demanding it. Not so much now. So we've got to be careful not to overstate the commercial reasons for certain things, for example, sustainability. If we're going to do sustainability, let's do it in a proper way and for the right reasons, because if you're thinking you're going to get a market premium for it, you might be sadly mistaken. So there's other reasons to do sustainability, because sometimes it actually makes good business sense from a production perspective, but from a market perspective, our experience has been it ebbs and flows depending on global conditions and depending on political conditions.
Well, thanks very much, Ash. That's all we've got time for. Clearly, biofuels has an important part to play in both the current crisis and ongoing as our sovereign capability debate continues. If you found this podcast via a link or on our website, please do subscribe on your usual platform. If you'd like to leave a review, that would be great. It helps people to find us. If you have any questions or suggestions, please email us at industry.policy@australianindustrygroup.com.au, and we'll speak in a couple of weeks. Thanks.
Thank you.